Heralding a new era in their relations, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping put on a show of unity as their countries grow increasingly dependent on each other. So is the Russian president's visit to China a step towards shaping a new world order? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Presidents Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have met more than 40 times in the last 10 years, signs of what the two leaders call a no-limits partnership. Putin's latest visit comes as Russia's dependence on China has increased in the face of crippling Western sanctions imposed over its invasion of Ukraine. Beijing's support has bolstered the Russian economy, and although it hasn't directly supplied Moscow with weapons, the flow of Chinese technology and goods have helped its war effort. Western powers are increasingly troubled by this deepening friendship between Russia and China. Will this collaboration extend beyond their borders, and could it lead to a shift in alliances and the global balance of power? We'll put these and other questions to our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Ibtisam Genford.
A symphony to celebrate 75 years of diplomatic relations. This is Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping's third meeting in a year, and Putin's first visit since the start of his fifth term in office. The president signed a joint statement on Thursday, declaring a new era in what both countries called their no-limits partnership. Strengthening economic ties that have kept the Russian economy going despite severe Western sanctions being imposed after its invasion of Ukraine. Trade between the two countries reached $240 billion last year, up 60% on pre-war levels, as Russia switched to importing goods from China, and crucially to exporting cheap oil and gas boycotted by the West. Vladimir Putin's visit aims to boost this energy partnership.
Our strategic alliance in the energy sector, which has become the supporting pillar of the entire global energy and resources market, I'm sure will continue to strengthen.
A visit full of symbolism to show that Russia is not alone, despite the US increasing pressure on Chinese banks and industries not to contribute to Russia's war effort.
We can see some indications that China maybe is tiring of the situation in Ukraine and the difficult position it puts it in vis-a-vis Russia, which is an important political partner, but then on the other hand, the EU and the US, which are much more important trading partners.
On his visit to France earlier this month, Xi agreed to control but not reduce exports of multi-use goods to Russia. Alongside Putin, he presented China as a stabilizing force.
Both sides agree that a political solution to the Ukraine crisis is the correct direction. The Chinese side looks forward to the early restoration of peace and stability on the European continent and will continue to play a constructive role to that end.
The two also took aim at the United States on a range of security issues, from Ukraine to Taiwan, saying they seek a counterbalance to a US-led world order that they both challenge. Ibtisam Genford, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Andy Marcus, Senior Research Fellow at Center for China and Globalization. He joins us by Skype from Beijing. Joining us from Moscow is Chris Weafer. He's Chief Executive Officer at Macro Advisory. That's a global risk consultancy. And Theresa Fallon is Director of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies, and she's joining us by Skype from Brussels. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Mark, I'll start with you in Beijing. I think it would be fair to say that China is the dominant partner in this relationship. So with that upper hand, what will Beijing be looking for from Putin during this visit?
Well, Elizabeth, I think the view from China and a growing consensus around the world is that the world is at a dangerous juncture where peace and stability are threatened by US-instigated actions. But for the United States, tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians would still be alive. But for the United States, the conflict in Ukraine would be far less destructive than it has been. And finally, but for the US, tensions in the South Pacific would not be anywhere near as high as they currently are. So I think what China is looking for in these latest discussions with Russia is how to mitigate and ameliorate these challenges to global peace and prosperity. And of course, I think from the Russian side, the situation in Ukraine is most acute. But I think both sides recognize the widespread, diverse threats to peace and prosperity, and that concrete and meaningful action has to be taken.
Okay, so Mr. Mok saying that China is very much looking to improve global peace and security in a partnership with Russia and the United States, and the West very much sees China and Russia as one of the biggest problems to global peace and security. Mr. Weafer, let me bring you in. Before we can talk about what Putin will be looking for during this visit, I do want to address what Putin has already got from China in the last few years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How much has Russia's economy, its defense complex, been impacted by Western sanctions? And what role has China played in bolstering both?
Okay, China has been critical in Russia kind of adapting or being able to adapt to the sanctions over the last couple of years. China is the biggest contributor to the Russian budget because of the fact it's the biggest buyer of oil and other materials, of course, everything from timber to aluminum and wheat. China is the biggest buyer. They're getting a good discount, of course, which helps the competitiveness of the Chinese economy. But it is huge, steady cash flow into the Russian budget. And that, of course, is the money which is being used to fund the military-industrial complex, as well as provide sort of economic stability. So China is being critical. Of course, the preparation for building up this trade hasn't just come as a knee-jerk reaction to the events or to sanctions. Russia and China have actually been building up the relationship since sanctions first started after Crimea in spring of 2014. For example, they built the big East Siberian pipeline, oil pipeline, which takes more than 1 million barrels a day directly into China, and also, of course, heavy investment into LNG and other materials. So China has been very critical in supporting Russia's economy and therefore allowing the Russian economy to, if you like, to survive and to be in what is in a good position today.
All right. Ms. Fallon, what did you make of Andy Mok's remarks about what China is looking for from Russia, vis-a-vis advancing global peace and security? And I also want to ask you, when the two countries talk about how their partnership has no limits, this is not the first time they've said it. They've said it for a few years now. I wonder, is that really the case? Do you think, can China continue to support Russia despite the economic, the diplomatic cost?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I think Andy's favorite book must be Alice in Wonderland, looking through the mirror, because I really don't recognize anything he just said. We just saw Xi Jinping visited Europe, and he visited France, Hungary, and Serbia. And Xi Jinping has a very difficult balancing act here. I mean, the size of the Russian economy is smaller than that of Italy, whereas for China, Europe is a key economic market for them, and they need to have a very careful balancing act trying to help Putin because of their no limits agreement that was announced in February 2022, just days prior before the invasion of Ukraine. And then they have to kind of try to tell Europe that we're not really supporting Putin when we see all the figures that Chris Weafer just noted, that this helps keep the military-industrial complex going, and buying this low-cost oil and gas actually fills the pay box to keep the war going on in Ukraine. So I think that Xi Jinping is fearful of losing these markets. Europe is actually talking about de-risking, and they've announced a lot of investigations into possible dumping. Foreign direct investment issues are coming to a head, and all sorts of electric vehicles are piling up at the ports, for example. So I think China's in a very difficult situation, but now they're in it to win it because they're in one sense handcuffed to Putin. And so they don't want to see Putin fail because they're fearful that the next leader of Russia might be more westward leaning. So they need to keep Russia inside their tent, even though they pay a huge reputational cost for that.
Yeah, Mr. Mott, China has been trying to walk a diplomatic tightrope, isn't it, in balancing support for Russia while not antagonizing countries in the West. I mean, Russia is something like China's sixth largest trading partner. It does much more trade with the US and the EU. Is it really possible to walk that tightrope successfully?
I think certainly it is, Elizabeth. And we can look at this from a more negative perspective, as I think Theresa laid out the Western view. I think a more positive take on this is that China plays a very important role to Russia, as we've just heard. It plays a very important role to Europe as well as the United States. Some of the issues that are impacting the U.S.-China relationship and the EU-China relationship are actually independent of what's going on with Russia. So I think China has a number of very, very powerful cards to play. If we look at the transition to a sustainable economy, there is little doubt that China is the technology leader in key components like batteries. It has the manufacturing scale to produce low-cost, high-quality, technologically advanced vehicles, as well as the design capability to provide consumer-facing products that consumers really cherish. So the EU, of course, has some concerns about this in terms of what this will do to their domestic auto industry. But this is not just China EVs. We also have to recognize the transition from internal combustion engines to EV manufacturing is also disruptive to the traditional automotive industry. So yes, there are complex issues. I think to call it a balancing act is certainly not incorrect. But I think China's position is much stronger, and it can play a much more powerful and pivotal role in bridging between Russia and the EU, including even the United States, I would say.
Okay, Mr. Weafer, one of the key issues for discussion is, of course, financial transfers between the two countries after the US imposed secondary sanctions in December, on banks that are doing business with sanctioned individuals, sanctioned companies, or for sanctioned products. How much of an impact are those secondary sanctions, those latest secondary sanctions, having on this relationship?
Those sanctions, which kind of crept up on us last December, they really weren't sort of, made a big deal at the time. But those particular sanctions are actually now causing the biggest problem and potentially pose the biggest risk for Russia's economic stability. Because Russia, of course, has been able to find ways to export goods, the ghost fleets, the getting around the oil price cap. But if it can't be paid for those goods, of course, then clearly there will be a major problem. And this has been a growing problem with trade partners since the beginning of the year, since the US really made kind of a big effort to get the message across to banks in China, in Turkey, in the Emirates, in India, etc., that they're running the risk of secondary sanctions if they are found to be involved in any transaction with a sanctioned individual or entity or a sanctioned process such as oil. So we've seen, as you alluded to, lots of banks in all those countries just pull back from Russia, take the cautionary step of not engaging in any financial transactions with Russia. And this is causing a huge problem. So it is definitely one of the top topics or one of the main issues that President Putin wants to talk to China about. They want to find a political solution to this, some way that the financial channel does not get blocked and that Russia can be paid for the products it's selling China, as well as being able to pay for the products that it's importing from China. And it's exactly the same conversation that's playing out with President Erdogan from Turkey, with Prime Minister Modi, and with the head of the Emirates. This is a huge problem. And it definitely, I think it's fair to say it's not the only reason why President Putin decided to go to Beijing so quickly after inauguration. Clearly, there are factors, but it's definitely one of the most pressing problems that they need to resolve. Otherwise, this will cause a major economy by the autumn.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw that March this year saw an 80% of all payment settlements from Russia to China bouncing at one point, and that's according to a pro-Kremlin business newspaper. Ms. Fallon, this week the US State Department accused Xi Jinping's administration of rebuilding Russia's military-industrial base and threatened what it called appropriate action. So even as we see the great impact of those secondary sanctions that came into force in December, could we be looking at more action, and what might that look like?
They have been signaling very loudly that this is what they plan to do. Now, if we look at the sanctions on Chinese companies compared to Europe, the US presently has about 100 and Europe only has 3. So they might coerce or put pressure on Europe to actually sanction more. And what China is very fearful of are the secondary sanctions. So this is something that is some leverage that the U.S. has. And I think we also have to remember, according to Beijing's narrative about sovereignty, we saw Russia invade a sovereign country. And according to the PRC, they are against that. So there's a lot of kind of hypocrites here, because to say that China is going to be a bridge builder when they're actually supporting de facto Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen increased exercises with jets over nuclear capable carrying jets over or near the waters of Japan. We're seeing more China-Russia maritime cooperation and exercises. So I think it's not that they're so far away from Russia. In fact, they're doubling down on their cooperation. And I think Xi Jinping really miscalculated. He didn't understand how the Russia threat was such a huge issue for the Europeans. I think he thought it was just not a big deal. They wouldn't pay too much attention. After 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, we saw Germany sign a gas deal just 1 year later. So I think he didn't expect that Europe would see this as such a major concern and that a top priority for them. So I think he didn't expect to have such pushback from the Europeans as well as the Americans.
Andy, Mark, how much of a concern is the war in Ukraine for Xi Jinping? And as Ms. Fallon mentioned, Russia has been carrying out military exercises using tactical nuclear weapons. Surely China does not want to see this.
I think China's position has been consistent and universal in that disputes should be settled through consultation, mutual respect, etc. Now, we know that the real world can be much messier than that, unfortunately. I think that with respect to the Ukraine conflict, it's well recognized that there's 3 wars that the U.S. is fighting. I think their strategy has been well articulated in many parts of the world to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian. In that there's the battlefield in Ukraine, there's the propaganda war being fought on Western media, and there's also the financial war as well. And I think this is the one that really is front and center for many Chinese policymakers, in that when we look at the dollar hegemony in terms of the U.S. dollar as a currency trade, SWIFT, that these are issues that clearly are on the agenda between China and Russia. The development accelerating, I think, the need for alternative financial systems that are not weaponized. And this, in the long run, is going to be highly detrimental to the United States.
I'm going to ask Mr. Weafer about China and Russia doing most of their trade in their own currencies next. I just want a quick answer from you, Mr. Mark, on does China want Russia to end the war with Ukraine? Yes or no?
I think the answer certainly is yes, isn't it? Again, I think that we can, there's clearly different views on the cause of this conflict. And I think Theresa has one set of beliefs about this. Many other people around the world, I would say most of the people outside of the Anglophone, a certain set of the Anglophone world, have a completely opposite view as to the cause of the conflict. So I think China definitely wants to see this conflict resolved through a political mechanism, as I believe President Xi has said.
Yeah, and yet the political mechanism that they put forward is absolutely not acceptable to Kyiv or any of its Western backers. Mr. Weafer, Andy Mock did touch on, the increase in trade. In fact, 90%, President Xi and Putin say, 90% of trade between the two countries is taking place in their own currencies now. Is that significant?
Well, yes, it is. And again, I refer to the fact that both China and Russia were preparing. Certainly weren't preparing for the scale of what happened since February 22, but we're preparing kind of, for some level of independence or for some different system from early 2014. I mentioned the oil pipeline, but also put in place in that period was a direct settlement system between the Central Bank of Russia and the Central Bank of China. Sort of, in other words, settlements between the two countries no longer rely on using, for example, SWIFT, which, of course, most of Russian banks have been excluded from. So they've done a lot of preparatory work. And this, of course, is feeding into the ambition, I guess you say, to expand the BRICS format and to make that into something bigger and something that's an alternative to China and Russia see as Western dominance. So I think a big part of the conversation, therefore, in the last couple of days will be about preparing for the next BRICS summit, which will be held in October, because we now have quite a few candidate countries, including Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, and others, that will have to decide by October whether they're going to formally join an expanded BRICS. And Russia and China will want to coordinate what messaging that they want to give to those countries and what message they want to give at BRICS. And a big part of it will be about trade cooperation, about financial transactions independent of the dollar, and to some extent creating, an alternative economic system, or maybe not so much economic system, but economic kind of philosophy within an expanded BRICS to compete with the West, rather than be part of as they see it, the Western-dominated economic world.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you've brought into the conversation, as we approach the end of the show, what this relationship between China and Russia also means for other alliances, most notably BRICS, that they are looking to expand. Ms. Fallon, I want to ask you about, what Russia's invasion of Ukraine has meant for China's view towards Taiwan. Has it emboldened China or perhaps made it more cautious?
If I could just pick up on one point. One of the easiest ways to end this war is for Russian troops to leave Ukraine. We don't need all these speaking points. All we need is for Russia to leave Ukraine. Second point would be that, yes, indeed, this is a big distraction, the war in Ukraine, because Andy said China would love to see it end right away, but I don't think that's the case, because it's distracting U.S. attention from their most important competitor, which is China in the Indo-Pacific region. And so this is a useful distraction for them. And China is learning a lot of things about stress testing the economy. We just talked about payment systems. They've also learned about inexpensive drone warfare, and also how the Ukrainians communicated using Starlink. And so they've looked for ways to prevent this happening in Taiwan. So on one hand, they think that if you open the Pandora's box of war, there are very unexpected things that could happen. I mean, Putin expected this war to end in 3 to 5 days. Now we're in the third year of this. So that is not something I think Xi Jinping would want. He would want something quick and easy. But there are other ways. You can squeeze a country. There are ways of, winning without fighting. And so I think that if there's any positive aspect of the horrific suffering and deaths in Ukraine, is that it might have given Xi Jinping pause to think about invading Taiwan. Now, we know the language that's being used, be prepared for war by 2027, the type of narratives coming out of China, young people, really talking about war. And it's really ugly. It's really discouraging. And I know we all want to be optimistic and have an optimism bias, but I think that, beating the war drum in this period, I think what has been clear under Xi Jinping is that he is more interested in security rather than the economy. So the economy is already facing horrible headwinds. They have a demographic problem. And now there will be sanctions probably, or increased tariffs on their exports. And we've seen what happened in the US, 100% tariffs on their electrical vehicles. So there's going to be a lot of pushback from the US and Europe. I expect that to happen as well. So I think that they have to calculate very carefully and handcuffing themselves to Putin and pretending that they're not so closely aligned with him when all we see is deeper convergence. And even their statement when they're holding up those little documents that they just signed, they're announcing that they have deeper cooperation. And of course, we don't see what's in those documents. It's secret. But I think that this is something that the rest of the world should be concerned about. And we're seeing a growing bifurcation. They want to have a separate economic area. They want to have spheres of influence. And I think that this is something anathema. We all learned what happened about these spheres of influence, and the post-World War II era was supposed to make it, globalization, free trade, all of these positive things. And we're seeing Xi and Putin doubling down on something that we didn't expect to see again, this growth of authoritarianism. Yeah. And let's face it, who's running to move to Russia? Who's running to move to China these days? Nobody.
Mr. Mark, would you like to come back on that, on whether China can really afford this closeness with Russia, given all of those pressures?
Well, not surprisingly, I see this completely differently. I think that clearly, as we've spent this program talking about, that China and Russia are strengthening its ties. But look at BRICS. Look at what's going on with Iran. Look at what's going on with RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. China really is deepening ties throughout the world, even in South America, Latin America, with Brazil. That really, Europe is a question mark, certainly. I think Theresa makes a great point. There are legitimate concerns that the Europeans have about how to adapt to a world where it is Chinese technological leadership, it is Chinese manufacturing cost competitiveness, and it is Chinese build quality that is leading the way. When we think in automotive, it used to be the Germans. So this is a huge challenge. And I think that they are concerned about Russia. What are Russia's long-term intentions? These are legitimate concerns, but I think there is a question mark here. And again, I think China is in a far, far stronger and more influential position than I think Theresa's portraying here.
Andy, Mark, we have run out of time, but thank you to all of our guests for this very lively debate. That is Andy Mark in Beijing, Chris Weafer in Moscow, and Theresa Fallon in Brussels. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.